You're listening to Middle East expert and keynote speaker Neil Lazarus, live from Jerusalem.
Hi, it's Neil Lazarus, and welcome to another podcast. Now, of all, a major thank you to everyone who's been listening, everyone who has given me support with these podcasts. And I know now people push me to do Snapchat as well. Give me some guidance there, but seriously, I'm very excited by the overwhelming enthusiasm these podcasts have been receiving from all around the world, and also positive feedback. If you want to be in contact with me, you can just drop me a line on my Facebook page. Look up Neil Lazarus. If you want to be a friend, it's full. I've maxed out, but I still have a page. So actually the page is called Neil Lazarus at awesomeseminars.com. You can traditionally just send me an email at awesomeseminars2001@gmail.com, or you can tweet me at my Twitter account at awesomeseminars. Happy to hear everything you've got to tell me about the podcast. Like I said, today we are going to be looking at bias, media bias. What does that mean? Is it just the fact that, people who are supporting Israel are just annoyed because the government's being criticized, or is it something deeper? That's what I'm going to argue today, and that's what we're going to look at today. I'm going to suggest the following. Look, first of all, media has its own necessities, its own exigencies. What do I mean by that? Is that old phrase, which I think I mentioned in an earlier podcast, a man walking down the road isn't news. A man walking down the road being bitten by a dog isn't news. A man walking down the road biting a dog is. So, okay, we understand that media has its demands, but media also has its competition, by the way. For example, the fact that you're listening to a podcast rather than listening to commercial radio is just proof of how much the internet is changing and challenging contemporary media. But that doesn't really quite explain why the media seems so critical of Israel. As I keep saying, criticism's good. The fact that we have a prime minister and a president in jail, or a former prime minister and president in jail, that's good. The scandals were broken by the Israeli media and the Israeli press. But is there a double standard where Israel is held to a higher standard than any other country? Or is it that when there is a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, it gets a disproportionate amount of coverage compared to, say, Syria, where thousands of Palestinians have been forced to leave their homes, but hey, who covers that one? I think the answer, by the way, is yes. I think Israel does provide a story which goes beyond the normal interest factor. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's that old saying that Jews make news. Maybe it is anti-Semitism that people like to be much more critical of Israel. But let's try and work out if it really is bias, or whether it's just, hey, opinion. I'm going to suggest to you a thing called distort. Distort stands for a distorted context, an imbalanced reporting, selective omission, terminology, opinions disguised as facts, reversal of time, or a trivialization of Israeli suffering. Let me repeat that. It's distort. D, distorting context. I, imbalanced reporting. S, selective omission. T, terminology. O, opinions. R, reversal of time order. And T, trivialization of Israeli suffering. Now, I want to give a shout out to two organizations. One is honestreporting.com. I think honestreporting.com is an amazing organization. They do amazing work monitoring, tracking, and fighting bias in the media against Israel. You also have other organizations such as Camera, but I think definitely Honest Reporting. I would look, support, join their mailing list. So let's have a look at distort. Distorted context. What do I mean by that? It's when an action happens in the Middle East that it happens and there's no context given to it. Israeli forces storm the Temple Mount, yet there's no recognition of events before. Perhaps Palestinian riots, perhaps people who are Jewish praying below and being stoned by Palestinians on the Temple Mount. What is the context of the Israeli action? Could you understand the Israeli action via that context? Only then perhaps we can judge whether the the action was disproportionate, yes or no? So a lack of context is one of my biggest criticisms of coverage, especially when media needs to cover a story in a minute or two, or maximum 2.5. Perhaps their excuse would be they don't have time to give the full story, the full context. I don't know. That's D, distorted context. I, imbalanced reporting. Imbalanced reporting I take as really portraying the Palestinians as always victims and the Israelis as always the aggressor. And you see this a lot recently. When there is aggression by Palestinians, which is unquestionable, Palestinian stabbing an Israeli waiting at a bus stop, you will often see the headline, 2 Palestinians shot dead by Israel as violence continues. They never mention that the Palestinians were actually about to stab someone and the police shot them dead. That's not a lack of context. That's just imbalance. That's just blatantly unable to show the Palestinians as victim. When we talk about, as anything other than victim, let me retake that back. You can tell this is live. I'm not editing, it's going straight out. Let's have a look at selective omission. That was the S in distort. What's selective omission? Selective omission says the following. Selective omission is what you're not seeing, what you're not being told. What's the detail which is left out? What do you need to be told in order to understand the full picture? Why is the story being told without that detail, without that information? Whether when police raid a Palestinian house, the omission is that they're looking for someone who's been guilty of a terrorist attack, who've killed someone driving in a car, who've shot or killed a 13-year-old Israeli in their home. The omission is as important as what's written. When you're reading an article, I ask you to do one thing. Ask yourself the question, what you're not being seen, what you're not being shown, what you're not being told. Is the story more complicated? Let's have a look at terminology. That's the T in distort. Terminology, I think, is important because you'll find that terrorists are never called terrorists. When does a militant become a terrorist? The joke goes a militant becomes a terrorist when it doesn't kill Israelis. ISIS has terrorist attacks, yet at the same time when Israelis are killed, it's Palestinian militants. Maybe we need to define what terrorism is. The use of violence for political means to achieve a political end aimed at non-combatants. Hold on. Isn't the vast majority of action taken by the Palestinians terrorism? What's the difference between terrorism and resistance? Is it resistance in the West Bank? But what about when a bus is blown up in Jerusalem? Or someone stabbed waiting at a bus stop? Is that resistance? Or is it terrorism? I'm not sure I have all of the answers to the questions I posed. But I draw your attention to what terminology is used. When do they only use militant to describe one side and terrorist to describe the other? When do they use the word civilian? An Israeli civilian was killed versus a Palestinian child aged 16 whose name was. These are very, very important examples of the use of terminology to create a biased understanding of what's happening. That's T. O of distort stood for opinions disguised as facts. It's that good old saying which is you can have your own opinions, but you're not allowed your own facts. Often we'll see news outlets such as Fox or Al Jazeera presenting news and saying that that news is facts. How much is it really the opinion of the news channel? I think we need to distinguish between reporting it as it is, as it happens, factually. And then op-eds. I have no problem with op-eds, but don't mix the two. When is the journalist allowed to provide an opinion? Should they say it's an opinion? You know, when I give presentations, I try to analyze the Middle East. I try and explain what's happening. I try to understand the narratives of both sides. I also stress that understanding doesn't always mean you agree, but I would express the complexity of a situation so that people can understand and make their own choice, their own decision, their own conclusion. That's my opinion to education. That's my attitude, rather, to education. Surely media should do the same. Maybe media should show complexity. Reversal of time. That's the R in distort. The reversal of time is when the order of events is reversed. Israeli soldiers storm the Temple Mount. Palestinians demonstrate violently in return, when the reality is the Palestinians were violently demonstrating, and therefore Israel had to storm the Temple Mount. Getting the wrong order is unexcusable. I would say it's a form of manipulation as well. Finally, the T of trivialization. T stands for trivialization. T stands for the trivialization of Israeli suffering. T is showing that only Palestinians can suffer and Israelis can't. Palestinian suffering is seen as legitimate, something you could empathize with. The Palestinians are written in the terms of victim. Israelis are only aggressors. Israelis cannot be victim. By the way, this idea of the trivialization of Israeli suffering in contrast to Palestinian suffering, I think is very important. The number of times I speak in front of an audience and I'll show a picture of an Israeli child running towards the shelters after Hamas has bombed Sderot, and someone puts up their hand and says, hey, yeah, but what about Palestinian suffering? I always talk about the tragedy of Palestinians suffering in Gaza who are caught between Hamas fighting a war with Israel using its own population as human shields and Israel responding. Of course that's a tragedy. War is a tragedy. But often when I show those videos, and the thing that disturbs me the most is when people say to me, yeah, we see those Israelis suffering, but what about the Palestinians? We've got to the extent now that Israelis cannot be portrayed as somehow the victim. You know what? It fits also into a little bit of how we in Israel see ourselves. We sometimes want to reject this idea of the Jews as victim. We have a post-Holocaust mentality, which is never again. But that idea of never again, of we're strong, we're a people after the Holocaust which has created its own state, may be true, but it does trivialize Israeli suffering. We're allowed to show that we're victims of violence as well. I know it contradicts the Israeli mentality of, I don't want to be a victim. Or, אני לא רוצה להיות פראייר של אף אחד. I don't want to be someone's sucker. Maybe part of the problem is how we present Israel as well. So let's summarize again the formula I gave you to understand distort. D. A distortion of context. I. An imbalanced reporting. S. A selective omission. T. Terminology, which is biased. O. Opinions disguised as fact. R. A reversal of time. Order. T. A trivialization of Israeli suffering. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you is a way of perhaps understanding the media in a much better manner.
If you love this podcast, you'll love the Neil Lazarus app. Just search for Neil Lazarus on the Apple Store or on Google Play. It's all of your news in one place.
And that actually is my plug for the day, if you like. We talk about the problem of media bias. One is, Okay, watch the media, understand its bias, perhaps embrace the bias. Watch conservative newspaper, television programs, watch Fox, watch right-wing TV, evangelical TV, and understand it as a way of understanding what someone who is conservative thinks. Watch a liberal program to understand what a liberal thinks. But where can you get news which is perhaps not biased at all? And the answer is you can't. Everyone has an opinion. The question is how you contrast those opinions. I often at home will drive my wife Elizabeth mad when I will watch Al Jazeera and then I switch over to Fox and then I'll go on to the Hebrew press. She was like, haven't you seen this once already? The reality is you can watch the same news many times and get different stories. What I've created is an app, the Neil Lazarus app, as you heard, which enables you to press one subject, say Hamas, and what it will do is it will give you the Hamas website and it will give you 5 or 6 different sources. Press Syria, you'll get pro-government, you'll get anti-government, you'll get pro-Russian, lots of different sources. In other words, each source has its own bias, and what you can do is either go into each source or just flick through it, just to get the headlines. But it's a great one place to get your news with different perspectives all at the same time. What I would suggest is you allow push notifications, so if there's a big story or even if there's a new podcast, I will announce it to you. That's the Neil Lazarus app. I'm happy that you're enjoying this seminar. I would love to see you a bit more and hear from you. So send me those messages. Tell me what you thought of this. Do you think the distort formula is a useful way of understanding bias or not? I've already seen as I'm podcasting, many people are writing to me. Feel free to be in contact, like I said, via Twitter or WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger. And until next time, we're going to say goodbye. Hopefully, I'm going to be able to see you at an awesome seminar, whether here in Israel, in Jerusalem, or perhaps in your own place, maybe in London or the United States or Australia or anywhere really. Let's make contact. If you have ideas, you have questions, forward them to me. I hope you enjoyed this analysis, perhaps short analysis on media bias, and we'll be back very soon with another seminar.
If you like this, why not invite Neil Lazarus to speak at your synagogue, church, or school? Check out his website, awesomeseminars.com.